Ice is so normal today that we barely even think about it. We drop it into our drinks without hesitation. We expect it in our restaurants. We assume it will always be there. But for most of human history, ice was impossible in hot places. And that raises a strange question. How did people in boiling hot cities like Calcutta and Havana get ice in their drinks decades before refrigerators existed? Not once, not as a rare luxury, but regularly in the middle of brutal summer heat. Because by the early 1800s, records show ice being used in some of the hottest cities on Earth. And that shouldn't have been possible. These places had no frozen lakes, no winter snow, no nearby mountains cold enough to supply ice. Whatever the answer is, it wasn't local. And it wasn't technological either. This was happening long before electricity, long before compressors, long before anything resembling modern refrigeration. So, the ice couldn't be made by machines, which means whatever solution existed had to survive heat, humidity, and time without melting away. And here's where it gets stranger. This wasn't just for royalty or colonial governors. By the mid-1800s, taverns were serving ice drinks. Hospitals relied on ice to treat patients with fevers. Ordinary households used it to preserve food. Prices dropped over time, which means this wasn't a miracle, it was repeatable, scalable, industrial. At this point, there's only one conclusion. If the ice wasn't local, if it wasn't artificial, then where was it coming from? The answer sounds impossible. The ice came from frozen ponds in New England, cut by hand in winter, shaped into massive blocks, loaded onto ships, and sent thousands of miles across the ocean. This wasn't symbolic or experimental. It was literal. In the early 1800s, entire lakes in Massachusetts and Maine were treated like crops. Workers waited for winter to freeze the water thick enough. They scored the ice into grits using long saws. They broke it into blocks weighing hundreds of pounds. And then they moved it. By sled, by wagon, by rail, and finally, by ship. In 1833, one of those ships left Boston carrying over 180 tons of ice. Its destination was Calcutta. The journey took 4 months. The ship crossed the Atlantic, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, passed through the equator where the air was hot, the sun was relentless, and the ocean warm. And when the ship finally arrived, more than half the ice was still frozen. It sold immediately. Because this wasn't luck, the ice was packed into thick layers of sawdust, stored in specially insulated ship holds, protect from airflow and sunlight. When it arrived, it was unloaded onto massive ice houses, buildings designed not to make ice, but simply to keep it frozen as long as possible. Once people experienced ice in extreme heat, they didn't want to live without it. Cold drinks weren't just refreshing, they were transformative. Ice allowed food to last longer, milk to stay fresh, meat to be transported further. Hospitals used ice to reduce fevers. Doctors packed wounds with it. Cities became more livable. For the first time, cold itself became infrastructure. And for a brief moment in history, frozen water became one of the most valuable global commodities on Earth. But this industry didn't appear by accident. It was driven almost obsessively by one man. His name was Frederick Tudor. He was a young Boston businessman when he first proposed the idea in 1806. Ship ice to the tropics. Everyone told him it was insane. Frozen water was heavy, it melted, and no one believed anyone would pay for it. His first shipment to the Caribbean failed. Most of the ice melted. The rest sold slowly. He lost money, and then more money. At one point, Tudor was so deep in debt that he was thrown into debtor's prison, but he refused to abandon the idea. Instead, he refined it. He experimented with insulation. He optimized shipping routes. He educated customers, teaching bartenders, doctors, and merchants how to use ice. He didn't just sell it. He sold the idea that life could be better with it. And slowly, it worked. By the 1820s, ice from New England was reaching Cuba and the southern United States. By the 1930s, it was reaching India. By the 1940s, ice from American ponds was cooling drinks on multiple continents. Entire industries sprang up around it. Ice harvesters, ice house builders, shippers, urban ice deliverymen. By the mid-1800s, ice had become one of New England's largest exports. Tens of thousands of people worked in the ice trade. Some historians estimate that by the late 19th century, nearly 90,000 Americans were employed directly or indirectly by the ice industry. But the system had weaknesses. The entire trade depended on cold winters. A warm year could cause an ice famine. Pollution became a growing problem as cities expanded and ponds grew dirty. And then technology caught up. By the late 1800s, mechanical refrigeration was becoming viable. At first, it was crude, expensive, and unreliable, but it didn't depend on winter, it didn't depend on clean lakes, and it didn't require ships crossing oceans with melting cargo. By the early 20th century, artificial ice plants began appearing in cities around the world. Once ice could be made anywhere at any time, the natural ice trade collapsed. An industry that had reshaped global life, that had connected frozen ponds to tropical cities, vanished within a generation. Today, we open a freezer without thinking. But behind that simple action lies a forgotten global system, a time when ice had to be harvested, shipped, protected, and sold. A time when frozen water crossed oceans, just so someone somewhere could take a cold sip on a hot day. Today, ice feels inevitable. It's everywhere, cheap, instant. So much so that we rarely stop to ask how it got here, or what had to exist before it. The ice trade reminds us that modern life isn't just built on inventions, it's built on invisible systems. Systems so successful that they disappear into the background. We don't think about refrigeration or supply chains or the centuries of trial and failure that taught us how to move cold across the world. Until something breaks, and suddenly what felt inevitable reveals how fragile it really is. People who first drank ice in the tropics weren't spoiled. They were witnessing the future. A future where comfort could be manufactured, where nature could be negotiated with, where distance mattered less than ingenuity. But the ice trade also teaches us something quieter, that even the most transformative systems can vanish, that entire industries once essential, once world-changing, can disappear so completely that we forget they ever existed. And maybe that's the real story here. Not just how humans learn to drink cold drinks, but how quickly we forget the systems that make our lives feel effortless.